Oh yeah, many a time you got yourself into situations that you would be doing a door knock, wanting to speak to somebody, shall we say, on the wrong side of the field. And there was many a times that I've had crossbows pointed at my chest, I've had a gun held to my head, threatened with knives. And particularly when you're female, especially if it's somebody male that you're looking at or you're confronting for something, they target your sexuality, and almost always it's a sexual threat because you're female, because they think that you're easy to intimidate. I'm 5'0" and I don't think I ever back down from anybody.
Good evening, Mr. Wood. How are you this evening?
I'm very well, thank you, Simon. How's things in the West?
We're a bit nervous in the West tonight, Tom. Things are on tender hooks through here, because here in Crime Time Inc., we have got, as you know, we're taking a big risk tonight because I'm handing the reins over to our outside broadcast unit through in Edinburgh, which is you, in other words. And I'm hoping that you're going to, if you get any trouble, just let me know and I'll bail you out as usual. Don't worry about that. You've always got underlings to help you. You've got a friend of yours, a very special guest here in Crime Time Inc. tonight, and I'm going to pass over to you to introduce us and let us know all about it. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks very much, Simon. Yes, indeed. Here from the Edinburgh studio tonight, we've got a very special guest. An old friend, an old sparring partner, an old irritant, an old nemesis. All of these things, sometimes all on the same day. Because tonight, in the studio, we've got Jane Halton. Now, Jane, she'll be too modest to say this, but for the last 25 years, even though she looks just a slip of a girl, for the last 25 years, Jane's been one of the leading crime reporters in Scotland, one of the leading investigative reporters in Scotland, prize winner, award winner, and one of these people, Simon, that when the phone went and I was told it was Jane on the phone, it was mixed emotions, because I thought, oh, it's Jane, I wonder how she's doing. And I thought, oh, it's Jane, what's she dug up now? You know the feeling.
I know it very well, yeah.
The other remarkable thing about Jane is she's actually quite profoundly deaf, but you would never know it. And it was years, I'd known her for years and worked with her for years before I realised she's such a good lip reader that you don't realise. But that's the reason she's a guest in the studio tonight, Simon. I thought it was better to have a two-way conversation rather than a three-way conversation, especially since Jane might be at a disadvantage because of her hearing.
And Tom, I believe that your friend Jane Hamilton is involved now in a cold case that's been solved, one from through here in the West that I was involved in as a young serious crime squad detective constable. Is that right?
That's right, Simon. That's the unique thing, how history comes around, because we're going to be talking about the Mary McLaughlin case from 1984, I think it was. And I know that you were involved in it as a young detective and made a mess of it. And then 30 years later, you were involved in the first unsuccessful part of the investigation, and it was cleared up later with the assistance of the press and Jane Halton. So I'm looking forward to that part of the conversation.
Jane, welcome to Crime Time Inc. You're something of an experiment, because this is the first time we've had a guest in the studio. We usually deal with guests remotely, so you're very welcome. We'll be looking forward to speaking to you for a while. I've promised much by this to Simon and to Chris, our director. So lovely to see you, Jane. Introduce yourself and tell us something about yourself.
Thanks for having me, guys. 25 years of crime reporter. Started off at the Edinburgh Evening News back in the early 90s, and then took a short break and came back. Worked for the Evening News. I was a transport reporter, believe it or not, when I first started, and the crime reporter went off sick and I grabbed my shot at it, and I've been crime ever since.
Did you always want to be crime, Jane? It seems a natural fit to you.
No, I fell into journalism by accident. I actually wanted to be a police officer, believe it or not. I was too short, so I couldn't get into what I wanted to do. And I had 2 young children, I had an English degree, and I knew I didn't want to be a teacher. So I didn't know what I could do with it. I started volunteering at a local free sheet in the north side of Edinburgh. It relied solely on grants, but it was a really good grounding for journalism, and I found that I enjoyed it. So I covered politics for them locally. I got to go down to London quite a lot, see how Westminster worked, and I thought this is actually, pretty fun, and it was great discovering things. It wasn't until I was at the evening news that crime came calling, and the minute I started it, I was hooked, and that's where I've been ever since.
It's funny, Jane, I've known you for a long time, but I didn't know you'd wanted to be a police officer. I didn't know that. And that's interesting because I've often thought, and I've said to Simon before, that good crime reporters and good detectives share a lot of characteristics. I've known a lot of crime reporters who would have been excellent detectives. I've cursed the fact that would have been excellent detectives sometimes, but I have. Simon, is that your experience?
Yeah, totally, Tom. So much so that quite often you have association with reporters, crime reporters, purely professional. I could rhyme off people that I'm still in touch with over the years because there's a rapport there. It might be that we're coming from opposite ends of the spectrum in many cases, but there is a common thread there because we're dealing with that part of our society, that there's a commonality there. And I think you're right, we could reverse roles sometimes because we understand each other, I think, Tom.
I think that's right. I remember one of my early bosses, a great man, I may have said this before on Crime Timing, an ex-professional footballer, he used to say that the police and the press play on the same pitch and we play with the same ball, but the goals are in different places and the rules are different. I've never heard it expressed better than that. That we have so much in common, but you've always got to remember that the goals are different and they always will be. Jane, you started with the Edinburgh Evening News. I remember you at the Edinburgh Evening News just as a young reporter. But then you went on to be at the Sunday Mail and the Daily Record, big national papers. Tell me, you were a young woman in a very much a man's world. How did you find that? Was that difficult?
Yeah, I found it very difficult. There was a lot of prejudice at the very beginning of my career that, because I was female and I had young children, that I shouldn't be working such long hours for a start. And in an evening newspaper environment, you would quite often work 13, 14-hour days because you were learning how to be a good journalist and learning how to tell a story. And evening newspapers were of vital importance back then for training for journalists to make the step up to the national newspapers. So there was quite a lot of prejudice. It was a very much a male-dominated industry and very few women. And at one point, I was the only female dedicated crime reporter in Scotland in the early 2000s. So, there was a lot of prejudice, or, you would get the odd comment from somebody saying you should be at home washing the dishes, or what does your husband think about you working all those hours? And women shouldn't be doing crime. You shouldn't be, door knocking criminals on your own. Take a snapper with you, a photographer. This is such a dangerous job, and you as a woman shouldn't be doing it.
Jane, it was a dangerous job.
Jane, are you aware of Rose Riley?
Vaguely.
Okay. I did an interview with Rose today for my football radio channel, Rose Riley. She won the Ballon d'Or. She was the best women player in the world at one point, and she won the World Cup with Italy. But she had to go to Italy as a 17-year-old to play because she was banned. Women's football was banned in Scotland. So all the issues that we were talking about today, she's laid the ground for what we now know as women's football here. And people like her and you being able to go into that environment, the smoke-filled, male-dominated environment, where you weren't welcome or respected. That's the word that she used today, was respect. My hat's got off to you for all women that have done that over the last 50 years, because it's now made it possible for our kids to go in and look at any job and be what they want to be now, without that judgment and bias and bullying, as she put it to me today as well. So well done for sticking at it.
Thanks very much.
It must have been times when it was dangerous. We often faced danger, but when you were a police officer, you had the strength of the whole police service behind you, and you had the authority of a uniform, and you had all that sort of stuff. You had backup, but you must have gone without any backup at all.
Oh yeah, many a time you got yourself into situations that you would be doing a door knock, wanting to speak to somebody, shall we say, on the wrong side of the field. And there was many a time that I've had crossbows pointed at my chest. I've had a gun held to my head, threatened with knives. And particularly when you're female, especially if it's somebody male that you're looking at or you're confronting for something, they target your sexuality, and almost always it's a sexual threat because you're female, because they think that you're easy to intimidate. But, I think I'm 5'0" and I don't think I ever back down from anybody.
No, that's right. Jane was always known as a terrier. A small terrier, but a terrier nonetheless. Jane, I happen to know that you've had difficulties with several very notorious cases. And I wouldn't want you to talk about anything that you were uncomfortable with, but is there any case that you can remember that you thought you were very close to the edge, that you were frankly frightened?
In 25 years, there's been probably several cases where there's been cause for personal concern. Lately, it's been over a solved murder from Lothian Borders in 2003. I've come under quite a lot of fire, and it's still ongoing today for my view that the correct person is in prison for that crime. There is a campaign to have a review. There's an innocence campaign going on, but I don't believe that. I believe that the police got the right person and the right man is serving life for that. There's been other instances where I've come up against football fans of certain supporters of certain teams who took exception to a story that I've published. And there's been death threats, there's paramilitary and sectarian. That was difficult. And I would say probably the most frightening incident I ever had was a man that I exposed as being a fake football agent. He was duping celebrities out of thousands of pounds. He managed to insert himself on national media, and I exposed him as a fake, and he turned around and began to stalk me for about a year. And again, because I was female, he targeted any vulnerability that he thought I might have, sexual threat. So that was quite scary.
Jane, that's fascinating, given that we're 2 days after the anniversary of the murder of Jill Dando. And I was just reading about that today. And if anybody's in any doubt about the seriousness of what you're talking about here, then there's plenty of instances that we could cite over the years and that we'll maybe look at in a podcast as the dangers of your profile, the dangers of speaking your mind. And as you say, the particular problems of being female in doing that, because there are people out there who target that and that alone. Tom?
Funnily enough, I was reading a very good piece in the Times today by Nick Ross, who was Jill Dando's partner, of course, on Crime Watch UK. And I met them both. I was on Crime Watch during the very early days, and they were a formidable pair. And Nick Ross leaves it in no uncertain terms what he believes. And he believes that the man who was arrested for it, Barry George, is guilty and should still be in prison. It was a very good piece, which I would recommend. Jane, you've moved away from the media or the press, and you're now freelancing. But still, this pursues you, because you were telling me when I met you first this evening that Police Scotland had been at your door regarding new threats against you.
Yeah, there's been social media has created a monster. People will say things on social media that they most likely would never say to your face. It's created it's like a village, and every village has got, what we call an idiot. So, you'll get people that don't cover themselves in glory on social media, and they don't conduct themselves in the way that they would in real life. So yeah, I've had some particularly serious threats over the last few days concerning my well-being, what they wanted to do to me. So the police are back again, trying to ascertain whether a crime's been committed or not.
If that happened to us, we would have the protection of Police Scotland as former officers. Do you get protection from your old employers?
I have to commend the Daily Record when any threat has ever been received for any of their journalists, and not just me, because obviously I'm not the only journalist that covers crime in Scotland. There's lots of crime reporters now, lots of general reporters that do work on some very difficult stories. And I've got to say that the Daily Record stepped up and they installed security in my home. And they made sure that mentally my well-being was good and that I was coping with the situation. They've got a dedicated staff member who deals with journalists that are dealing with abuse, because online abuse is a serious problem for journalists now. It's not, we're accessible. 25 years ago, we were just names in the paper and nobody knew who we were. Jane Hamilton could have been a male for all the reader knew, and readers didn't pay attention to the byline. But now, because we're public facing, we're on social media, we're engaging with the public, Our photos are there for all to see. The public have become a lot more vocal of what they think about the media in general, so that does make us target.
Yeah, I suppose that reflects the whole of society. Social media has been a fantastic boon. We're here today, speaking today on Crime Time Inc. because of social media, but at the same time, it's toxic in some of its applications, no question. Simon, I was going to ask you, my view through here, and I still have quite a lot to do with the media, I still write for newspapers, etc. My impression through here is that the media has changed out of all recognition, and that actually there are very few or none or no real investigative crime reporters left. Am I right? Is that, do you find that?
Maybe Jane can enlighten us here, Tom, because I know what you mean. But I think that possibly what we expected of crime reporters, what you and I are thinking of as a crime reporter back in the 80s and 90s, when they used to work hand in glove with senior investigating officers like yourselves, and we would campaign together, we would come up. The media releases and the media profile became part of the inquiry, the murder inquiry or whatever it happened to be, and there was a focus on it. I think it's changed now, and I think social media's got a lot to do with that. And crime reporters now are a different breed entirely. I don't know what Jane would make of that, but I think their job is different, the same as ours would be different now, Tom, if we were still police officers.
I think that the media landscape's changed incredibly. It's very, very different from your day and probably even mine. And I actually feel quite old saying that. But nowadays, reporters are under pressure to come up with stories instantly for digital printing. It's not about print newspapers anymore. It's about digital, and it's about getting hits and making sure that the public are consuming their product. And by doing that and driving traffic, they're having to come up with 5 or 6 stories a day. Maybe even, I've heard in some cases, 10 stories a day. It's not like the glory days where one reporter could work on one story for 3 to 6 weeks at a time. I remember being sent to the south of France for 3 weeks to track somebody on FBI's Most Wanted. That was just never happened now.
I think it was you that told me that this business about counting hits alone, that the leading story in one of the newspapers that you worked for, if I'm correct in my memory, was a recipe for a scone or something like that. Was that not, did you not tell me that?
Yeah, it was a couple of years ago now. These things are driven by the public clicking on those very stories. If there's something from TikTok or Instagram, like a recipe for a scone, or what the latest celebrity is doing on EastEnders or something, those are what the public will click on. And real stories, real proper hard news stories are being pushed further and further down the agenda. I've also noticed since the referendum, since 2014 actually, that there's a massive appetite for politics in Scotland. And that's been a huge revelation for me, because I was always taught crime sells, crime needs to be on the front. It's crime that sells newspapers. And while that's not changed wildly, there just seems to be more of an appetite for political stories rather than crime stories these days.
That's going to be much more relevant now. But it was funny because I saw a tweet from Jane the other day there where she was drawing attention to a front page story in a national newspaper with a story that the bodies of those that had been hanged at Barlinnie were going to be exhumed when the old prison was destroyed and redeveloped. And it was exactly the same story that Jane had on the front page 4 years ago. So there's a wee bit of recycling going on.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm sure Jane knows exactly what we're talking about there with stories they become paragraphs, just fillers in the newspaper. They're not dated at all, so they can be plucked from anywhere whatsoever. And it's all part of that creative process, Jane, if I could say that. Going back to the investigative reporting, Tom, I'm not sure that the reporters these days have even the same brief that they had back then. And they certainly don't have the relationships with police officers. Every Sunday morning, for example, in the crime squad, and at Govan, the press would phone every Sunday morning, put the kettle on for it. About 8 o'clock, you'd get a call from a reporter at the crime desk just asking what had been happening overnight. And sometimes the boss would say, give them this, give them that, give them the next thing. These days, that can never happen. Everything's controlled at headquarters now by the press boys up there, who are not police officers, I don't imagine, Jane. They're professional PR consultants, probably, and they're our press office. And Tom, I know that you worked in Lothian and Borders in associate with the Robert Black inquiry. part of your job was that a relationship with the press. But it's definitely changed. Apart from anything else, Jane, we don't meet in the Reporters Club anymore.
Through in Edinburgh here, it was a pub called the Jingle and Geordie, just off the high street. That's the other thing. There were huge press bureaus. When I started, the Daily Express had 6 or 7 reporters. Daily Record had a huge office. The Edinburgh Evening News had an investigative reporters team of 6 people. And that's a local evening newspaper. When I was a detective sergeant, I learned very quickly that all the DCIs, all the best DCIs who were running murder inquiries particularly, they had a trusted person within the media who they worked with. And as you said, Simon, this was not some add-on. This was a part of the investigative process to get the right messages out, to try and reassure the public, to try and get evidence. It really was a very important part. And I was heavily involved, as you know, in the World's End murders, which went on for many years. The assistance we got from the press nationally, internationally, and particularly locally with the Edinburgh News was absolutely amazing. I think about it now. It just couldn't happen now. But it was absolutely fantastic.
There was a real trust there, Tom, that had been built up over a period of time, that there was a mutual trust in both directions. That what was going on that front page or whatever it might be was tailored for the particular inquiry. The other way was that guy who could be trusted at the Record or wherever it might be was going to get access when the time came to parts of the inquiry and parts of the story that maybe nobody else was going to get. So there was a real marriage in there, a real relationship over many years that was built up. And I'm not sure that's even possible now because of the environment that we're in.
No, I think that's right. The other thing was, you'd occasionally get bitten. Jane, with all due respect, she's sitting right beside me, but she could give you a bite too now and again. But I always remember my old boss, my old chief, Bill Sutherland, who was the best I worked with. I would sometimes come to him and say, a bad story in the evening news, or a bad story in the other. And he would say to me, is it true? And I would say, yeah, we didn't know. He said, well, if it's true, what's the problem? Let's just get on with it. That was his first question. Is it true? Because you and I both know, Simon, that we didn't make a 100% good job of everything we did, but he was relaxed about it. He reckoned it was just part of the hurly-burly, and you still had to have that relationship. There was no point in going away in the huff.
My favourite saying for years, and I'm sure Tom will remember it, was, if I'm going to turn you over, I'll do you the courtesy of letting you know first.
Yeah, and she did as well. Yeah. But listen, I've got the $1 million question here, really, for Jane. $1 million question. She has worked all throughout Scotland and other parts, but mainly in Scotland. She knows every police force. She knows every police area. Jane, who were the best? What was the best area to work with? Now, Jane, can I just say, there's a wrong answer to this. And you're sitting here right beside me.
Am I being set up here?
Totally.
He wants me to say Lothian and Borders. Of course he does.
I want you to be fair and honest.
Okay, well.
You are under duress just now, sitting next to him, of course. We should point that out to our Crime Time Inc. listeners, that you're sitting beside him.
I have to, don't I? He's sitting right beside me, so with a very hot cup of coffee. I have to be honest and say that my experience before, the creation of Police Scotland, and it's a pet hate of mine that the relationships between journalists and police officers is completely lost nowadays. I've had cops tell me lately that they've got to declare their friendship with journalists, which stops any communication between the parties because they don't want to be accused of doing things and telling journalists things that they shouldn't be.
Yeah.
There's no relationship between journalists and press officers because they're just a voice on the end of the phone or a name at the end of an email. There's no relationship being built. There's no friendship. There's no trust there. We are dealing with an organisation, a faceless entity. There's no personal relationships anymore. So I think going back over the old days, I have to say that Lothian and Borders Police, especially particularly the press office, was excellent as compared to Strathclyde, where it was very much what Police Scotland is like nowadays. There wasn't that openness. And you could always go to Lothian and Borders Police and say, I'm going to do this story. Is it true? And if it was true, you would at least give them a heads up that it was coming. They never tried to stop it. So yeah, Lothian and Borders were pretty good. But I have to say, Strathclyde, Peter Tobin, it's a close one.
Let's leave it at that then, Jane. Let's leave it as a close one for now. And I'll rephrase the question and ask you, were there big cultural differences? I mean, in crime, in the world of crime, between the East Coast and the West Coast? Because I always found that there were. Police officers didn't necessarily cross that border readily because there was a whole change of mentality. That's how I always found it in the crime squad. And a few times I was through there on inquiries in Edinburgh, and we always found there was a kind of clash of mentality to some degree. Would you agree with that there was a difference in culture?
Oh my goodness, yes. It was such a culture shock for me when I left the Evening News and went to the Sunday Mail. Edinburgh had its fair share of grisly crimes and the usual bread and butter housebreakings and muggings and things like that. So when I went to work in the West, it was a proper culture shock because for the first time ever, I experienced gangland. And
Yeah.
that was pretty scary. Edinburgh had done a good job at keeping a lid on any gangland underworld activities. Organised crime wasn't what it was like in the West. And you would get a short, sharp lesson on how that worked. But also, any sectarianism in Edinburgh bubbles way under the surface, whereas in the West, it's very much, out there and open. So, yeah, definitely massive differences between the crime types, East and West.
Let me give you both a wee example from my experience then. Bearing in mind we can always edit this out anyway. But I remember as a robbery. There was a robbery through here. At the time, it was the biggest robbery that had been in Scotland. And it's a long story. It's probably a podcast in its own right because it was a fantastic inquiry. We got a positive result with at the end of the day. A bank robbery, an old-fashioned shotgun bank robbery. And part of the inquiry took us through to Edinburgh. And there had been firearms used in the commission of the crime. So we were through in Edinburgh to interrogate their intelligence system. And these days, everything was kept on cards and paper and whatnot. So we went through and basically we asked them, could you help us out here and point us in the direction of anybody who'd be capable of this, capable of that, car thieves, whatever it might be, robbers. And they brought out a file, Tom, in the crime desk. They brought out some information and they reckoned that there was about 20 or 30 guys in their knowledge who would be up for using a firearm in the commission of the robbery. And this astounded us in the West because at that time, we're talking back in the 80s, you could walk into a pub in Glasgow and for 20 quid or 20 Embassy Regal or whatever it might be, somebody would bring out a firearm and be prepared to use it. It was a completely different mentality, a criminal mentality that I found when we were through there.
Yeah, I remember that time. I was in the serious crime squad in the 80s during the bank robbery time. And most of the bank robbers, I say most, not all, most of the bank robbers that we had came from your side of the country, particularly for round about Barlanark. That was the sort of hotbed of bank robbers at that time. We never had the gang problems that you had because these gang problems tend to go with big industrial cities, Liverpool, Manchester, London, Glasgow, Belfast. We never had that, but Jane's right. We paid particular attention so that it didn't migrate to us. You know that I'm a bit of a police historian, but right from the 1930s, you can see in the old Edinburgh City files, the detectives writing and talking about preventing gangs taking root in Edinburgh. But I have to say, you talked about culture. You're right, because when I moved out to be divisional commander of West Lothian, which is west of Edinburgh and bordering on Lanarkshire, and I found then that the crime we had, the cultures we had, the sectarianism, etc., was much more akin to the west of Scotland than it was to the rest of Lothian and Borders Police. It wasn't just that the west of Scotland, the east of Scotland was different. It was that parts of the force were very different. And you started your life, your professional life in Argyll. There must have been absolutely no relation whatsoever to Argyll and the jobs you ended up doing in Glasgow.
No comparison whatsoever. We used different methods entirely down there. One thing, Tom, with the gangs, and it's interesting that you mentioned the cities there. In Glasgow, these crime families, none of whom I will name because I wouldn't give them the pleasure of their name being mentioned, but they had connections in turn down south. We had Yardies up here. We had all sorts of guys from down south. And basically, Glasgow was a fishbowl compared with what they were coming from down there. And these guys were absolutely ruthless, but they would target Glasgow. And as you say, you had your shortbread tins and your pipers and all that to deter them. I take it that's what you did. You had a couple of pipers playing on the border to keep them away.
All right, Simon. All right. Good. Yes, that's right.
I'll give them their due. 2003, Yardies did try and get a foothold in Edinburgh, and they were all captured. And that was it. They decided to decamp to Glasgow. Must have been an easier in there.
The truth was, I was in charge of that operation, and there was such a stick out. When the Yardies tried to move into Leith and move into the drug scene in Leith, they were such a stick out. You didn't have to be a master detective to see them coming. I think it's easier to hide and easier to operate in the bigger cities, particularly the big post-industrial cities.
And we also had the big migrant areas of Glasgow too, where people could disappear. And these areas are policed differently, Tom, as you know. They're policed much more sensitively, with an eye to the politics and an eye to the press. So they could come into these areas and infiltrate under the radar to some degree.
And interestingly now, of course, I've been writing recently about developments in the sex industry in Edinburgh, and the operators now are Romanians and Albanians. So we're also seeing international, not just intranational, but international crime coming and going. But Jane, I was going to ask you something. Of all the cases you've been involved in, and you've been involved in a lot, what's the one that sticks out for you? What's the one that really, if you're reflecting on your crime journalism, what's the one that really grabs you and why?
Oh, wow. Can I say that there's two?
Yeah.
The one that I think about the most is probably the culpable homicide of a young Edinburgh dad back in 2016. That case would go on to dominate 5 years of my working life. I worked with his father to get some laws changed, namely the biggest one being that multiple postmortems on victims of homicide. We managed to get that changed, and there was an agreement that if there were multiple defendants, there would only be one postmortem shared between them all. And I think about him quite a lot. His name is Sean Woodburn, a lovely, clean living businessman, everything to live for. Little girl left behind a little 4-year-old child. And I think the wastefulness of it was a one-punch killing. And I think about it a lot. I'm still in touch with the family today, in fact. We're doing more work because we successfully campaigned for the installation of a victims commissioner, and that's going to happen next year. And that's on the back of the Justice for Sean campaign. So yeah, that one sticks out at me. And the other one is, of course, and Tom, you're going to be disappointed by this because it's not an Edinburgh case, but Bible John. And as you know, I don't believe Bible John exists. I think he's a media creation. But I got very close to Helen Puttick's husband and spent a lot of time with him over the years. And George passed away last year. So I think there's never going to be any justice for those three women. Unsolved murders are a specialty of mine. That's what I look at. I've always been a very victim-centred journalist. I've always tried to keep at the forefront of my mind that behind every story that I do is a real human being. And I need to remember that, particularly when it's a homicide or culpable homicide, that there are grieving families at the back of what I'm writing and what I'm doing and doors I'm knocking. I think that quite a few of the unsolved murders that I've worked on over the years stick with me, and don't forget any of them.
Can I just say that the Sean Woodburn case is a very good example and super work done by you and your newspaper. Sean Woodburn was a young man who was out. It was New Year, wasn't it? New Year's Eve? Or
New Year's Eve, yeah.
New Year's Eve. And he just got set upon by a violent drunk. Somebody who was going around attacking people at will and had attacked a lot of people on the way, just drunk and violent. And unluckily, Sean took one punch and died as a consequence. Tragedy. But then to compound it, and Jane's absolutely right, because there was a number of people involved at start, a number of accused people, so there were a number of post-mortem examinations done on the body of Sean. And this compounded the agony of the family, the thought that not only their laddie had been killed in such awful circumstances, but that his body was being defiled time and time again, unnecessarily. And I remember you writing about it and me thinking, yeah, absolutely right. And I remember I wrote a column on that subject, and it was a great campaign. And I think congratulations to you. You really improved. There's a lot of victims there. One post-mortem is more than enough. So, yeah, well done.
Especially in this day and age, Jane, when the Crown and the defence share so much information now through disclosure, which is the way it should be. The whole process should be totally transparent. And there's no reason for a defence post-mortem, for example. All of that information should be shared. Can I just ask you, Jane, to come back a wee step and tell our listeners here at Crime Time Inc. about the Victims Commissioner? Because I think that's a fascinating title. What does it mean?
So we're hoping that next year Scotland will have its own Victims Commissioner. And basically, we wanted that put in place because the one overriding thing that we were getting back from people who have been victims of crime and their families was that it was a faceless, cold, brutal system that they were entering. There was no compassion. There was no communication. They would learn things such as trial dates or, very late in the process. And they just seemed to be forgotten. And they felt as if the whole system, the whole justice system, is geared towards the perpetrator and is geared towards moving toward smart justice, soft justice, and the rights of victims are being forgotten. And the hope is that with the Victims Commissioner, families will have a much better say in, for instance, when Sean Woodburn's killer was sentenced, he only got 4 years. And this campaign started trying to get that sentence increased. And it became clear that the victim impact statements that the family read out to the court didn't make a blind bit of difference to the length of the sentence. It didn't make a bit of difference when he was up for parole. Crime victims and their families feel that they are completely forgotten, and it's all about rehabilitating offenders and getting them back out into society. At the end of the day, we've got people that are suffering, and we need to remember that there are victims at the heart of every case.
I think that's fantastic, Jane.
I think that's absolutely right. Somebody once told me that the justice system was there for the lawyers, for the judges, and for the accused, and that witnesses and victims were just a necessary evil. And certainly the way that you're treated as a witness, very often, not always, very often in court, where you're dragged to court as a witness, you sit all day and then you're sent away and then you're dragged back, you certainly get the impression that you're not the priority.
Jane, when we think about it, the police investigate the case and take statements from the witnesses and give all that to the Crown, to the Procurator Fiscal. And the Fiscal then moves forward with the prosecution or not. And at that point, the police are neutral. They've given everything to the Crown, and it's up to the Crown to pursue the case. And there's an assumption in there from the police, very often, that the Crown will deal with the matter thereafter. They'll cite the witnesses that they want to cite. They'll carry out precognitions. They'll test the evidence before they go to court. And when they go to court, they'll have done so together with the witnesses that they're going to use in the case. What a stupid assumption that ever proved to be, because the Crown are never good at communicating, even with the police, in my experience, and I'm sure Tom will have a view on that. But the police couldn't thereafter take anything to do with these witnesses and victims in case we jeopardise the case, because you could never risk going to court as an investigating officer, a reporting officer, and being accused of having some association or friendship or whatever it might be with a witness, with a complainer, with a victim. So the police had to take a neutral point of view, even down to the witness room. Police officers would never go into the civilian witness room unless it was the court officer or somebody who had a right to be in there to help the witness get into the court. So we were very much hands off, but so were the Crown. The Crown treated these people as if they were just to be used as witnesses and discarded. So I can't congratulate you enough on what you're doing. And at Crime Time Inc., we love a campaign. We really do. So anything we can do on our website or any of our social media or whatever, when the time comes, I certainly would be 100% behind having victims looked after better and having somebody like a commissioner to represent their interests in all of this.
It's interesting because the police officer who's investigating the case, this is particularly true of serious crime, they have a real relationship with the victim because they're all the time, they're there at the scene. They often have to go and tell a family that their son or their brother or husband is dead. And so there is a personal relationship which the Crown cannot have. because all the Crown see is paperwork. And so I think of a victim commissioner who would be very good at, and the victim support services do a good job. They do a good job,
For sure.
but they're hopelessly underfunded and under-resourced for what they do.
I think the important thing to remember about the Victims Commissioner is it can and it must not be a political box-ticking exercise, and we can't have the position of Victims Commissioner being a political appointment. There's a lot of support for having a Victims Commissioner with lived experience of the actual justice system itself, so that they can understand what families and victims go through when they're going through the system, from crime to trial to parole or whatever. We have to have somebody there with lived experience, otherwise it is just going to be a political box-ticking exercise.
Jane, I think the guy sitting next to you must be in the box position, because he's on every other committee in Edinburgh just now.
Don't get me started on Edinburgh officials. That's a whole other podcast.
Thank you very much. Listen, can I move on? Because Jane's not only still a working journalist, she's also a writer. And she's written an excellent book of short stories, which I wanted to talk about. But also I want to talk about her next book, which actually is about a case, Simon, that you were involved in. This is going to be interesting to hear your recollection of that case, the 1984 murder case, and where Jane's coming from on that. But first of all, Jane, tell me a story. Lovely little book of short stories here, of which I've got a copy here. Tell me a story, Life or Death, by J.D. Hamilton. I didn't know you had a middle name. J.D. Hamilton, a collection of short stories. Lovely little book, little bedside book. Lovely flattering picture of you on the back, too. Super. Taken in about 1983 or something. Anyway, tell us about your short story book first.
So, Tell Me a Story is actually what I call my accidental debut. I quit the record in September 2022, and I'm going to be honest, I was completely burnt out. I'd had 25 years of nothing but death and misery and crime, and I was fed up with it. And I just thought, I've had enough. I don't want to be a journalist anymore, and I needed a break. And I started a little blog, a Substack, and it was nothing special. It was just me chatting about media and any other rubbish of the day. And I started to write short stories, and I think it was a way of coping, because I was incredibly tired and exhausted, and I had a lot going on in my head, a lot of any journalist that says they don't have a little bit of PTSD is lying, because I think that we've all got, cops as well, I think we've all got a little bit of it in us. And so the stories were a way of getting out, lifting myself out of darkness that I was feeling in at the time. Put pen to paper, the stories were flowing, I was putting them on the blog, and people were saying, oh, they're really good, we want to listen to more and want to hear more. So I ended up putting it in a book, and it's been selling really well. It's in the Amazon best-selling list, which for a little book of short stories, I'm actually quite proud of, because lots of people were telling me short stories aren't fashionable, don't print it, nobody reads short stories, but I'm proving them wrong with it. But yeah, so I'm very proud of it.
Yeah, so you should be. It's a lovely little book, and they're great stories. And I think you're right. I think there's a lot of future in short stories, especially if they're well written. And of course, the whole art of short story writing is on its own. It's completely different. But to know, so well done in this. Now let's hear about your next book, because this is about the 1984 murder of Mary McLaughlin. Now, first of all, Simon, you were a young detective on that case. Tell us what you remember about the murder of Mary McLaughlin.
Tom, you've spoke many times on here, especially with some cases that had longevity that you were involved in for a long time. And you spoke very passionately and very clearly about the ethos of a murder inquiry, and how, especially when it was children you were dealing with, Susan Maxwell, etc., that you had the pictures on the wall and you became involved in it. It became personal, let me put it that way. As a team, that's how it felt. And let me assure you, that's how it felt in Paisley. It's only 20 minutes down the motorway from Glasgow. We were working with the local CID down there. There was a huge team on the murder inquiry, and it was very close to Paisley town centre. And it felt solvable from day one. It just had that feel about it because of the brutality that was involved, because of the victim herself and her age. And boy, did we go at that. It was the most frustrating inquiry because it felt solvable, and we really, you've no idea the team effort that went into that. And we were racking our brains within a month or so because we just couldn't get a break of the ball. We had lots of leads, and you can imagine in a city centre like Paisley, vehicles and people coming forward. It was a very emotive crime that had the public fully engaged with it. I think it was Ian Wishart that was in charge of the inquiry, a fantastic detective. We were almost living in Paisley, and we couldn't believe that we couldn't get that wee break, Tom, that usually surfaces after 2 or 3 weeks of a major inquiry if you haven't got it right away. It never happened for us. And as you know, Tom, after 2 or 3 months, it starts to wind down. Other things come on board, and it was unsolved at that time, but it was a big, big frustration for every officer that was involved in it. And we spoke about it for years afterwards, and it was reopened several times because it always felt as though we'd missed something in there.
Sorry, I did remember the name, obviously not involved in it in a way, but I remembered the name. But Jane, take on the story there. So tell us, who was Mary McLaughlin? Tell us the story from your side of things.
So Mary was a mum of 11, and she had been married twice. She lived alone, and she was well known in our local community. She liked to go to the pub and play dominoes, get a bag of fritters on the way home. And she was a happy, cheerful wee thing. She would talk to anybody. As I say, she had 11 children, and she had difficult relationships with them because and I can only speak from the perspective of Gina, who wrote the book, and I'm editing the book for her. She had a very difficult relationship with her mum, and they were, at the time of Mary's murder, they had just started to reconnect with each other and trying to have a relationship. And Gina had her own family. At the time, Mary was a grandmother as well. Yeah, I spoke to Ian Wishart in 2014. The whole thing came about because I was asked to do an unsolved murder series for the Daily Record. That was come up with 10 stories that we could put into a crime pull out. And Mary's murder hadn't been written about for a while. And there was something about it that intrigued me. So I doorstepped Gina and asked her if she would speak to me again about her mum's death. And she was quite resistant at first. She didn't want to rehash it all up. But reporter's instinct kicked in, and I knew that Gina was sort of holding back on me a wee bit, and so I persisted, and eventually she agreed to an interview, and it turned out that she'd dedicated her whole life to investigating her mum's murder, and she wanted to get justice for Mary. And when I spoke to Ian Wishart, knowing what we know now with the benefit of hindsight, I felt desperately sorry for him, because when I spoke to him, he sounded, he said Mary was the one that got away, the only one that he didn't solve. And he was such a lovely, lovely person. And he was so kind. And he was telling me about the original inquiry. And I knew how hard the guys worked on the original inquiry. And now we know that it was never going to be solved at that point, because as we all know, the murderer was already back 60 miles away in Edinburgh prison.
Just for the sake of the listeners, can we just recount, because I think it's important. We all know the story of Mary McLaughlin, but others don't. So Mary lived on her own. She was 58 when she died. She lived on her own in Paisley. And in 1984, she was found brutally murdered in her own home. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
And Gina, who you're talking about, who is the author of the book, is one of Mary's daughters.
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah. So Mary's body lay undiscovered for 6 days. The night she died, she had been at the pub, her usual routine. She played dominoes with her friends. She went to the local chip shop, got some fritters. And the last sighting of Mary was in the company of a young man. And her body was found 6 days later by one of her children and his girlfriend. Absolutely horrific discovery. Automatically, big investigation at the time, and you were on that squad. You'll remember they threw out a big net over Paisley, trying to, you pulled in every known sex offender in the area, housebreakers. I think at one point early in the inquiry, there was a theory that maybe it was a robbery gone wrong and Mary had disturbed somebody. And various theories over the years, but it was obviously it was a sexually motivated murder. And Gina, as I say, has spent 36 years looking at her mum's murder, recording conversations, visiting police officers, harassing the police every week to look at her mum's murder, not to forget Mary. It's an absolutely incredible story, and it's an incredible story of one woman's determination to make sure that her mum was never forgotten about. And that was her motivation for speaking to me, a journalist, a stranger, a complete stranger that she'd never spoken to before. And she said, if you're going to do my mum's story, I want you to make sure that you do it justice. You remember that my mum was a mother and a grandmother, and she's not just somebody on a piece of paper to you. And we did Mary's story, and unknown to us, the forensic scientist at the time was reading the Daily Record the day that story ran, and that's what prompted her to go and look for the productions that would eventually nail Mary's murderer. And if you want to know more, you're going to have to buy the book.
Good.
We covered this just recently on Crime Time Inc. We talked about the Homicide Review Board now in Police Scotland that routinely goes back and visits old evidence from murders and retests them and looks at them anew. And so there's nothing left lying, as used to be, frankly, in our day, Simon. Unfortunately, that was the way it sometimes was. They're constantly reviewed and examined under the microscope of new science. So that's really good. Now, I don't want to spoil the book for you, but the culprit was eventually detected and he had no local connection at all. Is that right, Jane?
As far as we're aware, the culprit had no local connection to Paisley. And we have to go back and remember what era it was. It was 1984. There's no communication between police forces like there is now. Not that instant electronic communication. There was no home system then. There wasn't that channel of communication. And I've spoken to Ian Wishart and I've said to him, did you ever consider that the killer was somebody from out of town? And he said, quite honestly, no. It's not something that we thought about. And we would never have thought about a prisoner on day release. That would just never have entered the equation. And as we know now, by the time Mary's body was found, her killer was already back in prison. He was never going to be looked at by the squad that were investigating Mary's murders. And that's the tragedy of it. It was never going to be solved at that point.
It reminded me very much of the World's End murders in Angus Sinclair. When our girls were murdered in Edinburgh in 1977, we started from the middle and worked out. And it was very difficult to imagine someone travelling all the way from another part of the country to commit these murders. They looked like local murders, as did this. And of course, when the culprit was eventually caught for the murder of Mary McLaughlin, it turned out to be a man from Edinburgh, a man called Graham McGill, who was a sex offender, had all the right credentials, but of course was an Edinburgh man, had been on day release. And this is the bit that intrigues me, Jane, because he had made his way all the way to Paisley. Now, I would suggest there had to be a connection there. There had to be some sort of connection through in Paisley.
It was never ever discussed in court why he was in the Paisley area and why he would waste precious time travelling to Paisley on public transport when he only had a 2-day pass from Edinburgh prison. The crime reporter in me thinks that there was something that drew him to that area, somebody that he knew, maybe an old girlfriend or a friend. Something drew him to Paisley. I do sit and wonder sometimes what made him target Mary. How did she appear on his radar? And that's something that only he can tell us.
If I can say this, Jane, that thinking, that logical thinking that you're giving us there about how you would narrow this down, these are the things that we do right at the start of the inquiry and throughout the inquiry, is look at those parameters. Tom sometimes talks about profiling because he had dealings with the FBI. And it's what we're doing all the time, is looking at the most likely scenarios. But if the guy just got on a bus and didn't really care where it was going, and he ended up getting off in Paisley because it was the end of the line or whatever. And when we think about the house, did you ever go to the locus, Jane? Did you know where the locus was?
Yeah, it was just a nondescript council flat, wasn't it? Yeah, and I don't actually think it's still there now.
No, it's gone. But you would think the house-to-house inquiries, if somebody had been chapping doors, a salesman or somebody selling his services, or even a bogus person looking for vulnerability, he would have chapped other doors, he would have been seen at the local newsagents or whatever, being in the area. It seems to me that this guy, it was a totally random act because we found no trace of him. Maybe we had a few statements lying that described a guy not further described in his 20s or whatever age he would be at that time, but nobody that we could say, wait a minute, who is that guy? So it's that type of inquiry that makes it so difficult at the time, because we're using the same logic that you're using right there.
The good thing is that Graham McGill was eventually convicted in 2021 as a cold case. There was justice for Mary eventually, but the book is called Justice for Mary, and it's coming out at the end of this month, the end of May. I think.
End of May, yeah.
End of May.
You've just spoiled the end of it, Tom. Chris, you'll need to edit that. You need to edit that out.
Nobody's going to buy the book now.
The whole story, the ins and outs of it. And it's a great story, and it's a story worth telling. Now, Jane, what next? What are you going to do next? What are you writing next?
So I'm putting the finishing touches to my first full-length fictional novel, which was supposed to be my debut. And I'm actually really surprised I've just qualified as a humanist celebrant.
Lovely. Congratulations.
So I've got my first wedding booked for later in the year. I'm turning my energies to that and hoping to ease off the journalism. It will still pull me in. I'm picking and choosing what stories I'm working on. But I think my immediate future rests with fiction.
Give us a teaser then. What's your book about? Why fiction? Your head must be so full of real crime stories. And here in Crime Time, we always say that truth is stranger than fiction. So why fiction? And give us a little teaser of the plot.
As a child, I did a lot of fiction writing. In fact, I was published in Reader's Digest, if anybody old enough to remember that magazine. I was published in Reader's Digest when I was 14 with short stories. And that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to write a book. I've always had an active imagination. And then 25 years of journalism will kick that out of you because, like Tom says, truth is stranger than fiction. And a lot of the cases that I've worked on, if I did that in a fiction book, people would say that's totally unbelievable. But, I don't want to be writing true crime forever.
Jane, please tell me that it's not about a retired deputy chief constable who gets called out of retirement to investigate a murder in Edinburgh somewhere. Please tell me that at least.
Oh, no, it's not. I mean, he might have a little part to play in it, but no, it's about the disappearance of a 16-year-old girl from the wrong side of the tracks in Edinburgh. Police are not interested, and lo and behold, local crime reporter rings. And I'm not going to give away any spoilers. What I will say is that I pull in some of my political reporting experience, and I'm not giving away a spoiler, but it does have a little bit of a politics angle as well.
I'll look forward to it. Have you got a working title?
It's called Death Knock.
Death Knock. I like it.
Death Knock.
Death Knock, yeah, that sounds good. Right, we'll look forward to that. Now, Jane, before we finish, every guest we have, we always ask the same question. Tell us, have you had in your career a sort of penny drop moment? One of these moments where suddenly something has just a blinding truth, an epiphany that has changed the way you act or work or think throughout the rest of your career?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I have actually had been at the Sunday Mail for about 6 months. And you knew me when I worked at the Evening News, and I was a little hard nut, remember?
Yes, I remember.
I could be quite cool and calm, and I wasn't as full of empathy as I am now for the people that I was writing about. And then I went to the Sunday Mail, and I had to do a door knock. A death knock, believe it or not, was what we called them. It was a young man, 17, had been found dead by suicide. And I remember walking up to the front door and having my usual, what I would say now, arrogance. I like to think of myself as a nice person. And when I think back to that, I did have an arrogance about me when I would knock a door, because I thought, why won't they want to speak to me? So I remember knocking the door, and the dad came to the door. He was obviously completely grief-stricken, and he wasn't very nice. He was, and quite rightly, he wasn't. How dare I go to the door? His son had just passed away. Who did I think I was? And didn't have any morals and didn't have any compassion. And I walked away and I burst into tears. And I sat in my car for about an hour thinking about what he had said to me. And it was probably at that point that I realised I didn't have any compassion, because I was banging somebody's door who, not 24 hours later, had lost their 17-year-old child. And I just thought, there has to be a better way to do this job, because reporters are never going to stop. People will always want news, and people will always want to read miserable news. They will always want to read criminals, about crime and about criminals, because it's not happening to them. They want to revel in everybody else's misery. And I thought, there has to be a better way for me to do that. And that is when I probably turned into the type of reporter that put the victims first. And that's been a good 20 years that I've worked that way, and always tried to remember that it's real people.
Mhm. That's a great story, and I think as police officers, we've all encountered that thing, just that moment of levelling, to remember just who we are and who we're dealing with are real people, whether they be victims or offenders, actually, or just witnesses to the crime.
It's interesting you say victims or offenders, Jane, because we both know exactly, and any police officer listening to this knows exactly what you're talking about. And we've probably all had that experience when we were younger. But what Tom says is important, because I always felt sorry for the mums of the accused, of the guys that were in custody, were locked up, and we had to go and tell them that they might not see their kid again for a long time, and that they'd fallen by the wayside or whatever it might be. And I always felt sorry for the mothers, because it was the mothers that they'd let down more than anyone else in the big scheme of things.
That's right. Okay, Jane, thank you so much for being our guest. We've been wanting to get you on Crime Time Inc. for a while. You've been a super guest, and can I say that when we're dealing with media matters, we'd like you to come back on and give us your view, because you've got such a wide experience in the media and how it works that I think you'd be a very valuable special guest for Crime Time Inc. Now, can I just say that we don't have any money and we don't pay fees, but you do get a Crime Time Inc. t-shirt.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
Jane, see if you get a t-shirt to fit you, then there's something wrong with you. That's the truth of the matter. Jane, can I just clarify one thing? This book, you're going to be called J.D. Hamilton, is that right? Is this the new trend? Is it new trend? Is J.K. started this?
So I put the D in the middle because my long-suffering husband has to put up with me quitting my job and going freelance. And he's been very supportive in that I'm not bringing in a regular salary these days. So it's all shifted onto him. And I just felt that he needed that little bit of recognition, he'd allowed me to pursue what has been a lifelong dream, to be able to write a book. I just felt that the D had to come from him.
Oh, is that where the D comes from?
Yeah.
Ah,
Yeah.
I thought it was just a J.K. Rowling thing. I think it had become trend to use the two initials now.
But listen, don't
What?
destroy my reputation here. I'm not a romantic. I'm as hard-nosed as I've ever been.
And I can vouch for that.
It's been an absolute pleasure having you on, and I can only back up what Tom says. You can become our sounding board, and if there's bad things to be said, we'll let you say them, because we both want to be good guys, and I think we maybe need a bad guy. Jane, I'm sure our listeners will back us up in this. It's been fantastic, and I look forward to the time's flowing, and I look forward to speaking to you again. Thanks for doing this for us. Thank you. And putting up with Tom for all this time, for over an hour.
No worries. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Simon.
Next time on Crime Time Inc.
And so they have a party, they all get drunk, and then there's a moment where everything changes and where there's a fake sort of confrontation. The women leave, the women know what this means, and she is killed, smothered in the usual way. He's not going to interrupt the party. He's got enough money for more drink. We'll just shove the body under the bed, and nothing should interrupt a good party. Some whiskey is sprinkled across the bed just to make sure that any offensive smells are blinded. The ladies are brought back in, and the party and the dance continues. So it'll just be like a lot of the parties you've been at, Simon.
Yep, sounds very familiar, Tom. Very.